I've always known Holy Cross is on a hill. I feel it every day as I walk from Kimball Dining Hall back up to my dorm. But there is so much more about this place I never knew. I didn't know about the Nipmuc people, who lived here hundreds of years before Europeans arrived and who still live here. I knew this hill has different names. College Hill, Mount St. James, but its oldest name I'd never heard. Pakachoag, an Algonquin word which means where the river bends. This is the story of this interesting place, because it is a good thing for all of us to know where we are.
Katakwakwa wani, natasawa show Tony Holly, Santkwa hasana mesera and Nipmuc. That means good afternoon. My name is Cheryl Tony Holly, and I am the female leader of the Hatsanimisco Band of Nipmuc Indians in the Nipmuc Nation. My people have been here for millennia and still exist right here in this very place. We're standing in the remnants of the village of Pakachoag, one of the bands of Nipmuc Indians. We have been here forever. I mean, we're your neighbors, we're your friends, we're the people who teach your children, the people who nurse you when you're sick in the hospital. Our children go to school with you, play on the same sports teams. We're a community of people, and we're right here, right in the midst of you.
When local Nipmuc people look up here, they think of Pakachoag. And I know that there are Holy Cross alum who, with a certain fondness, remember Mount St. James. However, Pakachoag is what Native people see when they look at this hill. The Native community asserts that there was a great rock at this hill that the community always referred to as John Eliot's Rock, from the perspective that the evangelist John Eliot spoke at this hill, and for creating this huge athletic complex, the rock outcropping here on this hill was destroyed. And in some ways, that's symbolic of the great native history of Pakachoag, which seems to have been obliterated by Mount St. James. Our purpose here is to make visible the relationship of the indigenous people to Pakachoag Hill, Quinsigamond Village, and the College of the Holy Cross. Our native people are often imagined either disappeared or romanticized, and we hope that this work will problematize both of those notions. In the indigenous language, Pakachoag means at river bend, or where the river bends.
If you look at the campus, and particularly from an aerial photo from above, you'll notice that it arcs, and that arc corresponds to the bend in the river, which is Pakachoag. Another thing I'd love you to do is to be able to look out at this landscape, but look at it from the topography. Look at the hills and look at the valleys, and imagine it without all these buildings being here. And instead, imagine people who are living over by Wigwam, people who are living over by Astabumskit, people who are living here, and in between you have forests and fields, you've got cornfields, you've got places to go fishing, and you have lots of streams. You wouldn't have seen all these large bodies of water because almost all the bodies of water in Worcester are dammed. And the two that aren't are Lake Quinsigamond and Bell Pond. Pakachoag was the largest of the 3 villages that make up modern-day Worcester, consisting of about 20 families or about 100 individuals. Generally, when we're working with cultural or historical or archaeological studies, we have objects to work with, for example, arrowheads. In the particular case of the Nipmuc, and here at Pakachoag, we don't have as much to work with. Among the objects we do have are baskets, a drinking bowl, and a mortar. And these objects that we can hold in our hands and touch make it real and help us to understand the community that was here. Threat of attack are why the Nipmuc settled where they did on Pakachoag Hill. Traditionally, they would have settled along the riverway in order to make use of the fish and transportation network near at hand. But under threat, they would have chosen a site that was high atop a hill with a clear line of sight. And the key aspect is a spring. The spring provides fresh, clear drinking water and allows them to have a settlement. What they would have also done, in addition to a clear line of sight, is potentially had some kind of a fortification, maybe even a stockade or a wall or a fence, so that they had a defensible position.
Here we are on Ellie Way, which is exactly at the border of Worcester in Auburn. But this was the site of the original spring of the village here at Pakachoag. A barn from a house around here had been dumped into the spring, so it was blocked off, in the 1930s.
This path here leads to the lower ground, which is where the spring was. And we know this from older maps that we've been able to look at and reconstruct. That area currently has been filled in with the barn, so there's no longer a water body present. But once upon a time, local kids would even go down there to ice skate. It is our hope that as a significant historical and cultural site, some portion of this could be preserved so that future generations have a sense of where Pakachoag comes from and where the Nipmuc lived and where our community originates. Some people don't realize that Holy Cross is on a river. The highway can make that hard to see. The new Blackstone River Park connects Holy Cross campus back to the river.
Colin, what sense can we make of this river and the changes of the land here in Nipmuc country based with this water and its connection to the Blackstone?
Well, this water here where we're standing is the major river that comes up from the estuary down in Providence, and it stretches all the way up into Holden. It would have been called Katatic by the folks who lived here as the Great River, the Central River, the river they lived around. It was known to others as Nipmuc, Nipnet, but those would all describe it as freshwater and describing the people who lived around it. The thing that's really neat about this river for me is it was the transportation route. So the people who lived in this area were up in an area where farming and hunting were the primary universe, but this river allowed them to be able to get down to the coast. So this was sort of a transportation corridor for people moving back and forth and moving goods in particular back and forth. But that's sort of the old river, the Katatic, reaching up into Holden. And now it's gone through a lot of iterations since then. When the English arrive, they renamed the river the Blackstone River, which is what it's known as today. Along that river, industry grows. For instance, the Whittle Rug Mill, which is clearly visible from the Holy Cross campus and its clock tower. Further down the river, we have U.S. Steel and the Washburn and Moen Wire Works, which were making wire, steel, and importing Swedish immigrants with their specialty in metalwork. That area today now has the Blackstone Visitor Center and Walmart. This whole area was dammed, and all the phragmites, all these tall reeds that we look at, and this whole flat plain was one big impoundment of a pond, and all that water ran the factories that were immediately down below us to the south until we moved away from water power. And then it became the system that would flush out all of the junk and all of the waste and all the pollution. So they would still dam this up, but to flush out the factories at the end of the day. And then when they stopped having U.S. Steel and all the other major factories, the Washburn and Moen Wire Works, when those all went away, it returned to its old state, a water course running through a wetland plain. And that's sort of how we end up today with Blackstone Gateway Park, which is a mix of city park and city conservation land, and a window into Worcester's past, both its far past and its industrial past. As we've been walking along the river, a lot of what we've been seeing are these tall, feathery plumes of reeds, and they would be called pampas grass. But what we're looking at right here is exactly what should be here, and this is cattails. And these are the native plant that should be along the river and in the wetland areas. And unlike its Asiatic invader, this has a key role, not only for wildlife, but also for the native people who are here. Everything about this would have been used. The tall stalks with the leaves would have been able to be woven into baskets. The roots are an edible food source, and even the tall fluffs at the top can be used for different purposes. But this is a window into what you should expect along the river and what you should see in a native wetland that's healthy. And right here in the center of Worcester, we still have these cattails, and still a pocket of them exist. If you were to be paddling along this river even 10, 15 years ago before the Walmart went up, you would be going by some of the old U.S. Steel buildings. You'd have the corrugated siding. You'd be able to look and see the U.S. Steel symbol spray painted on the old metalwork. You would also be able, on the right-hand coast, to be able to see these interesting sort of rock forms, but it ends up being slag. It was the slag heaps coming out of the factory into the river and seizing up like lava as it came to hit the water. And you would still be able to see those old remnants of our industrial past while canoeing. And you can canoe this. You can not only canoe this little section here, this mill pond area, but there are those of us who've had the opportunity to canoe from here in Worcester at this stretch all the way down to Pawtucket, and to be able to follow the course of the river the way that people had done in the past. It is still possible. The river's fish would have served as a major source of food for the Nipmuc, as would the local fields, with some hunting to supplement, particularly over the winter months. Welcome to Cookson Park. This is a City of Worcester park, but there's been a lot of history that's gone on. The more recent history is this was supposed to be a subdivision. It had even been laid out with the roads drawn out and lots drafted, but in the end it wasn't built. And as a result, this became a public open space that is now a city park. But this isn't the way it always looked. In fact, if you were to take the clock back to before settlement of this area by Europeans, it would have been larger oak trees as an overstory with blueberries as an understory. It is something that would have been burned over on a periodic basis in order to keep the brush low and to keep the hunting good. And then as time moved on and you had settlement, all of the trees in this area would have been cut. They would have been cut for materials for housing, for heating, and for packaging when we finally become an industrial city. Every stick, every twig would have been laid low. And that's partly because the Europeans would have been going with their predominant model of land management, which would have been large, grassy, grazing fields. And that's what this became, one large grass grazing field. What you see here, all the trees around us are less than 100 years old, and they're the result of benign neglect. Basically, this field stopped being cut, stopped being mowed, and Mother Nature took it back. If you were to let the clock run far enough forward, eventually you would get the larger trees and the understory that you would expect from the pre-settlement period, but only if we also had fire move through periodically in order to trim it back. So what you're looking at now is closer to what it looked like before settlement, but not what it really looked like. And for most of its period, while in European settlement hands, it would have been one large grazed field.
I think that Pakachoag village must have been a beautiful place. It still is beautiful, and I'm sorry that Holy Cross is built on it right now because, I mean, just going up there and looking down on everything, it's just beautiful.
I'm in front of an image that might be familiar to several of you, which is the representation of the indigenous person on the Great Seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because part of the narrative of Massachusetts has always included the notion that the indigenous people here were happy to encounter the Europeans, and that allegedly the first utterance of Massachusetts native people to white Europeans was "much welcome Englishmen." The first documented or recorded visits that the English tell us about are in the 1650s, when Reverend John Eliot, the first minister of the First Church of Roxbury, traveled into Nipmuc interior with the hope of being able to convert people. Eliot was one of several 17th century Puritans who believed that the indigenous people of the Americas were a lost tribe of Israelites, and somehow their conversion to Christianity was going to bring about the millennium and the return of Jesus. The original seal of Massachusetts Bay does have on it an indigenous person, and the motto comes from his mouth of what he is saying is, "Come over and help us." So there is this assumption among educated Protestant clergy at this period of time that the charter given to Christianize Massachusetts Bay needed to be taken seriously. Natives in the greater Boston area had for many years been listening to Eliot, and one of his greatest successes occurs in what is now known as Newton, Massachusetts, which in Algonquian was Nonantum, a place of rejoicing, because this is where he gathered his large first group of converts. Eventually, people from this community and other natives agreed to come together to live in Christian commonwealth at Natick, Massachusetts, the first of what will become a series of settlements or encampments of Christian natives and other converts. Interestingly, the land for these communities had to be granted to Indian people by the Commonwealth, and it is in fact a native family by the name of Speen that cedes its ancestral rights to the Natick homeland to create the community at Natick. Among these potential praying towns would have been Pakachoag. Negotiations were taking place in the summer of 1675 to formally designate Pakachoag a praying village. Once communities were defined by the provincial legislature as praying villages, they had certain rights and prerogatives that other native communities didn't. Unfortunately, the King Philip War intervenes, and Pakachoag is never legally defined as a praying town. It's difficult today to assess the profound significance of the 2 to 3 year conflict in New England known as the King Philip War, whether we're talking about southern New England or Maine and northern New England. However, in simplicity, Of the 90 New England towns that existed in 1675 at the start of the conflict, 52 were attacked and 12 destroyed and abandoned, including the first settlement of Worcester, which at that time was called Quinsigamond. Now, perhaps as many as 3,000 to 6,000 Native Americans died in this conflict. A higher percentage of the population suffered death or wounds in this conflict than in any other American conflict. Battle deaths alone exceeded over 10% of the standing armies. And the cost to the United Colonies was in excess of 125,000 pounds, which today would be an astronomical sum. But it's estimated at between 6,000 and maybe 10,000 of the indigenous people of New England supported Metacomet or King Philip, with perhaps as many as 5,000 other Indians supporting the English cause. The results were hundreds of people being enslaved and deported and sold outside of New England. The remaining New England Native Americans are forced into smaller settlements under a closer supervision and watchful eye of English residents. And significantly, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, which had underwritten activities at Harvard College in support of the evangelization of Native people, withdrew its financial commitment from the perspective that the evangelization of New England Indians had failed. Though this conflict is clearly of significance and will shape a good deal of New England Native American history, it is an error to imagine that there is pre-King Philip War and post-King Philip War. One of the things that we are attempting to demonstrate with this documentary is the continued presence and persistence of an indigenous people on Pakachoag Hill. And the popular notion is that New England Native people disappear or become insignificant or irrelevant after the King Philip War.
Pakachoag is significant in the history between colonists and Nipmucs because their leader, who you would call Sagamore John, first fought against the English. He welcomed King Philip. He helped in many raids on many English towns, but then he sort of took the other side and helped the colonists take captive other Nipmuc men and other Nipmuc groups, particularly people from Marlborough, and brought them to Boston, helped to execute them, Sagamore John did. But unfortunately for John, the colonists turned on him and held him captive, sold some of the people that came with him into slavery in the West Indies, and by some miracle, John and his son and a few others managed to escape, and they came back to this place. So Pakachoag for us historically shows how our relationship with not only the colonists back then, but our people now, the English now, or the Americans now. Can we trust them? Can we not trust them? This never-ending battle between them and us, and how we're always seemingly on the losing end, even when we put our faith in people or allies or the English, or I guess you call yourselves Americans now. We still somehow are on the losing end.
We know that early in the 18th century, Native families have come back to Pakachoag Hill. No one else was living on the hill at this period of time, and one very important and prominent Native family named Weiser will long occupy the hill. And their presence here is something we are going to be able to see till well after the Civil War. We will be visiting the site of the Weiser homestead, which is at different times in history between a 250 and 300 acre holding here on Pakachoag Hill. Deacon Benjamin Weiser in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s will be a leading churchman here in Worcester County, and he will be one of the founders of the local anti-slavery society of clergymen. I know many Holy Cross students like to jog and run through the area, and if we're trying to be specific about where the Weiser family lived, we can use Walmart and that huge shopping area as one marker and recognize that the Weiser homestead is going to be between Walmart and Greenwood Street in the immediate area of St. Catherine of Sweden Church, which is on Weiser Street. The last of the Weisers to live on the hill were females. One does marry a family named Tatman, and there is a Tatman Street, and the Tatmans are well remembered in Quinsigamond Village. To a certain extent, we talk of two founders here at Holy Cross, both Father Fitton and Bishop Fenwick. Bishop Fenwick is the Bishop of Boston who ordained Father Fitton and assigned him to Worcester to meet the pastoral needs of its then small Catholic population. Irish workers had come to Worcester in the 1820s to work on the canal and other projects, and they stayed. Initially, Catholics who died in Worcester were shipped to Providence or Hartford to be buried, and there was no church for people to receive sacraments. So on the one hand, Bishop Fenwick is instrumental in facilitating the creation of Christ Church, later St. John's Church, with Father Fitton. And he plays a prominent role in the creation of the first Catholic cemetery here in Worcester, and he is also involved with the purchase of the site, which is later going to become Mount St. James and Holy Cross College. You know, there's an almost forgotten connection of Holy Cross to Indigenous people. Bishop Fenwick accepted responsibility for the Catholic Indians of Maine. He visited them and assigned Father Fitton to meet their pastoral needs. Now, with the founding of a Catholic church here in Worcester in the late 1820s, Father Fitton continued his relationship with the Indigenous people of Maine, and we know that during summers, Maine native people would come and camp out here in Worcester to receive the sacraments and to be near Father Fitton. It's estimated that 20 to 30 families would come to spend the summer here in Worcester. We don't have local descriptions of where they stayed other than derisive comments referring to Scalping Town, located between Holy Cross College and where St. John's Church is located now. One underappreciated part of Holy Cross history is the fact that one of our more celebrated athletes is a Native American and is of Penobscot Indian heritage, Louis Suckalexis. His grandparents were supposedly among Maine Indians who had been making the annual pilgrimage to Worcester to be near Father Fitton and receive the sacraments. He will join a team at Cleveland, Ohio, and will persuade other natives to join him for what will eventually be known as the Cleveland Indians. Louis Suckalexis has a somewhat troubled life. His biographies make clear that he was plagued with alcoholism. He will later develop tuberculosis. 2 years after he dies, the team at Cleveland supposedly to honor him, changes its name to the Cleveland Indians. So our Louis Sokolexis does indeed have a connection to the Cleveland Indians. Contemporary scholarship has documented for us how important it was, particularly in the 19th century, for Americans to incorporate the history of the indigenous people as part of the great American narrative. For a variety of political as well as romantic reasons, Indian place names are evocative. This relationship of new people to Indian names is really somewhat extraordinary, and it is part of a European appropriation of Indian experience as the prehistory of white America.
A good example of both the romanticization as well as the shift of meaning of names comes with Mount Wachusett here on the horizon. Wachusett means around the place of the hill. So the idea of Mount Wachusett in making a mountain out of what was the area around the hill is a wonderful example of already elevating the status of the hill to mountain.
There's a very exaggerated example as one is entering Massachusetts from Connecticut on the highway. You are welcomed to the state and you encounter this monstrosity, Lake Chabanagagamogamog. The pond there was originally Chabanagagamogue, real simple. But that in the 1830s, when many sites in this region are being given European romantic names, Chabanagagamogue, Manchagamogamog is invented. And it is now represented as the biggest word in the English language. It never existed. In the 1930s, a newspaper man at the Webster paper said that its meaning was, you fish on your side, I fish on my side, nobody fishes in the middle. Well, I mean, quite literally, Chabanagagamogue just meant fish boundary, that's all. And there is this marvelous tune by Ethel Merman from the 1940s.
Lake Shaw, gog, 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 Muncha, gog, gog, gunga, mog. Lake Shaw, gog, 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 Muncha, gog, gog, gunga, mog. Lake Shaw, gog, 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 Muncha, gog, gog, gunga, mog. There's a lake in a state where the fishing is great, and the name of the lake is a riddle. You fish on your side, and you fish on your side. Nobody fishes in the middle. It's
Kids in Webster, with great pride, repeat this. I mean, it's an accomplishment to be able to get all of that together. Chabanagagamogamog, Manchagamogamog. Heap big Indian word. That's all it is. For the first 100 years of its history, Holy Cross did indeed remember the indigenous people of Pakachoag and the indigenous people of the United States, but it did so in a very romantic, nostalgic sort of way that we see throughout the 1830s and 1840s. The romanticization was expressed in the first promotional material that would have us imagine that Pakachoag, instead of meeting at River's Bend, meant at Place of Beautiful Springs, and this was clearly articulated in the first advertisement for the Mount St. James Seminary for young men here in Worcester. This advertisement tells us, the institution is situated on a most delightful eminence which bounds the flourishing town of Worcester on the south, called by the Indians, it being the site of their former village, Pakachoag, or Hill of Pleasant Springs. This eminently healthful location, which as a seat of learning is not surpassed by any spot in New England, is within a few minutes' walk of the center of Worcester and junction of the railroads from Boston, Albany, and New York. And the fact that Pakachoag does not mean place of beautiful springs is consistent with a romantic notion of Nipmuc people who have become a memory, and a memory that can be utilized in marketing and promotion as if real Nipmuc people no longer existed. That romanticization persists into the 20th century with the founding of a student newspaper here on campus, originally called the Tomahawk. And through much of the 20th century, we can find other examples of Holy Cross students playing Indian.
The first issue of the Tomahawk, Holy Cross's student newspaper, was published on February 17, 1925. As the editor then explained, quote, "The name is in accord with all the traditions and history of the college. Freshmen have always spent their first 2 weeks learning how to pronounce Pakachoag, the Indian name for Mount St. James, the hill of Pleasant Springs. Relics of the Aborigines have colored the march of events in the college ever since. Indian motifs always figure in advertising and decorations. The Tomahawk will come as naturally to Holy Cross as the Heights to Boston College, or the Hoya to Georgetown." End quote.
When Holy Cross students were considering a name for the athletic team, Sagamore Indians and other native theme-related possibilities were considered for our athletic team, which ultimately became the Crusaders.
In 1955, the Tomahawk student paper changed its name to the Crusader, which had become the official symbol of the college. As the paper's editors argued, the Indian-derived name was no longer suited to Holy Cross. Quote, "Holy Cross and Indian traditions do not seem to mix well. The Nipmucs, who lived here, mean no more to us than the Blackfeet or the Crow, and an attempt to create an Indian atmosphere on the hill is a hopeless task. In Crusaders, however, we have something unique. It is unusually appropriate." End quote.
We've spoken about our local indigenous people as being both present and absent at the same time here at College Hill. And a good way to visualize that is to look at what happens here at the Auburn-Worcester border, where Pakachoag Street in Auburn and what used to be Pakachoag Street coming up the hill has now been replaced by College Street. So we've also, spoken about names, and it's really significant that Pakachoag, though remembered in the Pakachoag Golf Course, Pakachoag Street, Pakachoag Music School, and remembered by a lot of older residents in Worcester, has primarily for younger people just become College Hill.
The Nipmuc presence in the landscape is largely marked by names, be that here at Pakachoag or in Grafton at Asnabumskid or Wigwam Hill. Unfortunately, in many cases, while the name is retained, the knowledge of what that represents is lost.
A marker frequently ignored by many people in the community is this marker at Malvern Road and Southbridge Street, which draws attention to the spring of the village of Pakachoag and the native presence of Pakachoag Hill. This is one of 275 markers that were erected by a Mass Tercentennial Commission in the 1930s. And in many ways, it was a very distinguished group of scholars and community people attempting to commemorate portions of the 300th anniversary of the arrival of the Puritans in Massachusetts. Now, 125 of these markers remain. These markers were put up with good intentions, and even though their object is theoretically to commemorate the presence of the indigenous people of this region, these markers ultimately indicate places where people once were but are no longer to be found.
Preservation just means something different for us. It doesn't mean a place that's untouched, that no one else can use. There's a use associated with the relationship, right? So if you have a relationship with your mom gives love to you, you give love back. It's the same thing with the relationship with the land. So part of the reason why my community is struggling, I suppose, with their identity right now is that we lost that relationship to the land. Because of that, we lost our relationship with each other. And it's very important because we're all part of the same world. The plants, the animals, the people, the water, the stones, we're all part of the same world. We all have a relationship to each other. We all have a responsibility to each other to take care of one another. So that's why land preservation is important to us. Not just something to look at, but something to live with. I do want to thank people that do go out and preserve places, but I want you to remember that as Indigenous people, we have more right to that place. This is really our land. I mean, I get that we're conquered. We didn't really sell anything, we were conquered. But it was still, we have the Indigenous right to respect our land and to be in relationship with it. We make sure our children know about our history, not just the history of Nipmuc, but the history of this whole country and everything that's happened. So history is relevant to our past. It's by retelling those stories, by remembering what happened before, that we can live our lives in the present and plan for the future.